The white was the first thing Jedediah Stone saw. It was a defiant splash of bone white against the endless, shimmering brown of the Nevada desert floor, a thing so out of place it had to be a lie. The sun in late summer was a merciless hammer, and it played tricks on a man's eyes after hours in the saddle. He was sure it was a mirage, maybe a bleached animal skull or a peculiar salt deposit, but the shape held, steady and unnatural, as his black horse Cain plodded forward. It was not a skull. It was fabric. A dress, to be precise, the kind a woman might wear to a church social if there were any churches for 100 miles in any direction. And in the dress was a woman, small and still, standing beside a pathetic, broken-down handcart with one wheel splintered into ruin. She was Chinese, her hair a coil of polished jet against the impossible white of the dress. She stood as if she were waiting for a stagecoach on a town street, not for death in the middle of nowhere. Jed pulled Cain to a halt. The horse snorted, shaking its head, the leather of the harness creaking in the oppressive silence. Jed was a man who had made a study of keeping to himself. His small homestead, carved out of rock and hope, was his sanctuary from a world he no longer had much use for. He was riding back from the mountains with a side of venison, heading for solitude, not complications. This woman was a complication of the highest order. She was at least a day's walk from the nearest settlement, Redemption Gulch, and that was a day for a man with long legs and a full canteen. She had neither. Her face was a mask of calm, but he saw the fine tremor in her hands, the slight sway of her body as it fought to stay upright. She was 18, maybe, a girl playing at being a woman, stranded in a place that unmade men twice her age. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the hot dust. The air tasted of baked earth and distance. He walked toward her slowly, not wanting to spook her. She watched him with dark, unreadable eyes. She did not cry out, did not beg. She simply watched him approach, her dignity a fragile shield against the vast, empty sky. "Water?" he asked, his voice a rusty hinge from disuse. He held up his canteen. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. He knew what that meant. She was past thirst, into the stage where the body begins to shut itself down. To drink now might save her, or it might shock her system into collapse. It was a gamble, but leaving her here was a certainty. He looked at the broken cart. A single trunk was strapped to it, a few meager belongings scattered where it had overturned. It was clear what had happened. Someone had brought her this far and left her. The white dress he now saw was styled like a wedding gown, or at least a frontier version of one. Simple, but new. Someone had brought a bride out into the desert and discarded her like broken tack. His jaw tightened. He had seen his share of cruelty in the territories, but this was a special kind of cowardly. It was a quiet murder, outsourced to the sun. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to ride away and pretend he'd seen nothing. Taking her with him meant riding into Redemption Gulch. It meant questions. It meant trouble. His past was a shadow that grew longer in the presence of other people, and he had worked hard to find a place where it couldn't touch him. But then she blinked, a slow, tired movement, and for a second the mask of calm slipped. He saw a flicker of raw terror in her eyes, the desperate fear of a young life about to be extinguished in a forgotten corner of the world. He had tried to bury the man he used to be, the one who stepped into things that weren't his business. He thought he had succeeded. He was wrong. He walked back to his horse and untied his canteen. He unscrewed the cap and approached her again, holding it out. "Just a sip," he said, his voice softer this time. "Slow." She looked from the canteen to his face, and a decision seemed to pass through her. Her hand, small and steady, came up and took it. She drank as he had instructed, a small, bird-like sip, then another. She handed it back, her head bowing in a gesture of thanks that was as foreign as it was graceful. He took a long look at the road back toward his homestead, toward the quiet life he had built. Then he looked at the unforgiving horizon in the other direction, toward the town and all its noise. There was no real choice to be made. He gestured with his head toward the imposing black shape of his horse. "Get on my horse, woman." She looked at him, then at the tall animal, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. It was a long way up. He offered no further encouragement, simply waiting. He could not force her, but he would not leave her. After a moment, she placed one hand on the saddle and with a surprising bit of grace managed to pull herself up, her white dress bunching around her. Jed swung himself up behind her, his body a solid wall at her back. He picked up the reins. He did not yet know that by lifting her from the dust, he had just challenged the most powerful man in Redemption Gulch. He only knew that the silence felt different now. Shared. The ride to town was a long, slow affair conducted under the sun's unblinking eye. Jed kept Kane to a steady walk, mindful of his passenger. The woman, whose name he still did not know, sat ramrod straight in the saddle, her hands clutching the pommel. She did not lean against him, did not utter a single sound of complaint. Her endurance was a quiet thing, a stark contrast to the unforgiving landscape. He'd seen hardened men break and weep in this heat, but she remained a pillar of silent resolve. He offered her water every hour, and she took it in the same small, measured sips. He tried a few words of the Cantonese he'd picked up from railroad crews years ago. "Name?" he asked, the word clumsy on his tongue. She turned her head slightly, her black hair brushing his arm. "Leanne," she said. Her voice was clear, low, and held a music that the desert lacked. "Jedediah," he replied. It felt strange to say his own name aloud. It had been a long time since he'd had reason to introduce himself to anyone. They rode on. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal shades of orange and red. The heat finally began to recede, replaced by the coming chill of a desert night. Ahead, the low, clapboard shapes of Redemption Gulch emerged from the haze. It wasn't much of a town, just a single dusty street with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a handful of houses. It was a place ruled by one man's ledger and the weight of public opinion. As they entered the main street, heads began to turn. A man like Jedediah Stone riding into town was unusual enough. Him riding into town with a Chinese bride perched on his saddle was an event. Doors opened. Faces appeared in windows. The low murmur of conversation ceased, replaced by a thick, watchful silence. Jed felt the old, familiar tension settle in his shoulders. It was the feeling of being watched, judged, and found wanting. They stopped in front of the largest building, the Abernathy General Store and Mercantile. Before Jed could even dismount, the door swung open and a large man stepped out onto the porch. He was dressed in a fine wool suit, ridiculous for the weather, a gold watch chain gleaming against his expansive vest. This was Orville Abernathy. He owned the store, held the note on half the claims in the county, and carried himself with the unshakable confidence of a man who believes the world is his to command. Abernathy's eyes swept over Jed, dismissed him, and settled on Leanne. A look of pure disgust twisted his fleshy features. "Well, well," Abernathy boomed, his voice carrying across the silent street. "Look what the buzzards didn't get. I figured you for dead by now, girl." Jed felt Leanne stiffen in front of him. He swung a leg over Kane's back and landed softly in the dust. He stood by the horse's head, his hand resting gently on its neck, keeping himself between Abernathy and his passenger. "I told you to wait by the dry wash," Abernathy continued, pointing a fat finger at Leanne. "My freighter was supposed to pick you up and take you to the work camp in Carson City. You were supposed to be gone." He then turned his attention to Jed, his eyes narrowing. "And you, Stone, I know who you are. This doesn't concern you. This merchandise is faulty. I sent for a wife, not some half-starved, barren-looking thing. She's my property until her passage is worked off. Give her here." The word property hung in the air like poison. Jed didn't move. He looked at Abernathy, his face calm, his eyes flat and cold. The town was watching, every man and woman on the street an audience to this confrontation. This was Abernathy's stage, and he was used to being the only actor on it. "She's not property," Jed said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the silence like a razor. Abernathy laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Is that so? She has no papers, no sponsor. She belongs to me. Besides," he added with a sneer, "the simple creature doesn't even speak a word of our tongue. She's useless." It was then that the woman spoke. Leanne shifted in the saddle, her back still perfectly straight. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was perfectly clear and carried an accent as sharp and clean as cut glass. "I can speak, sir," she said, her eyes fixed on Abernathy. "I simply had nothing to say to a man who leaves another to die in the sun." A collective gasp went through the small crowd of onlookers. Abernathy's jaw dropped. His face, already ruddy, turned a deep, furious purple. He had built his power on public humiliation, on being the one who always had the last word. In a single sentence, this small woman he had written off as a mute animal had stripped him of his authority in front of the entire town. He rounded on Jed, his voice shaking with rage. "You'll regret this, Stone. I'll see to it. That homestead of yours? Land claims have a way of getting lost in the territorial office, especially for troublemakers." The threat was plain. It was no longer about the woman. It was about power. Jed had publicly defied him, and for Abernathy, that was a sin that required punishment. Jed simply turned his back on the sputtering merchant. He looked up at Leanne. "Let's go," he said. He took Kame's reins and started leading the horse down the street, away from the store, away from the silent, staring townspeople. As they passed the doctor's small office, the man himself, a kind-eyed soul named Dr. Albright, stepped out and spoke in a low voice meant only for Jed. "Be careful, Mr. Stone," he whispered. "You should know. Abernathy wasn't just her intended. He paid her passage from China. He holds the contract. In the eyes of the law, she might as well be his." Jed nodded once, a grim acknowledgement. The weight of his decision was beginning to settle in. He hadn't just saved a life. He had invited a war to the front door of the one place on earth he had hoped to find peace. The homestead was little more than a dugout, a one-room shelter carved into the side of a low hill, reinforced with cottonwood beams and a sod roof. It was stark, clean, and solitary. For Jed, it was paradise. For Leanne, arriving in the dark, it must have looked like a burrow. He lit a single lantern, the yellow light pushing back the shadows, revealing a simple cot, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a cold fireplace. He offered her the cot. He would take the floor. She said nothing, only watched him with those dark, observant eyes. The silence in the small space was thick with things unsaid. They were 2 strangers from different worlds, bound together by a single act of defiance, and now trapped in an intimacy neither had sought. He made a small fire and cooked the last of his bacon and some beans. They ate without speaking, the scrape of forks on tin plates the only sound. After they had finished, Leanne went to the small trunk he had retrieved from her broken cart. She opened it and took out a small, intricately folded piece of paper. It was worn and soft at the creases, as if it had been handled many times. She brought it to the table, and in the flickering lantern light carefully unfolded it. It was not a contract. It was a letter, covered in elegant Chinese characters. "My father wrote this for me," she said softly, "before I left." She looked at him, a question in her eyes. He nodded for her to continue. "He was a scholar," she explained. "Not a rich man. He taught me to read and write. He believed a mind was a woman's greatest dowry." She paused, her finger tracing one of the characters. "The matchmaker promised a good man, a merchant in America who wanted an educated wife to help with his ledgers and business. My father sold his last 2 goats to help pay for my passage." She began to translate the letter, her voice steady, but Jed could hear the thread of sorrow running through it. It was a letter full of hope and fatherly advice. It spoke of honor, of remembering her ancestors, of being a good and faithful partner to the man she was to marry. It ended with a plea to the heavens to keep his only daughter safe in a strange land. "Mr. Abernathy was not pleased when he discovered I could read," Leanne said, her eyes downcast. "He said he wanted a worker for his store and a wife for his bed, not a clerk who would have opinions. He said he had been cheated." The cruelty of it settled in Jed's gut like a cold stone. Abernathy hadn't abandoned her because she was faulty merchandise. He had abandoned her because she was a person, intelligent and whole, when all he had wanted was an object. The confession seemed to open a space between them. Jed found himself speaking of things he hadn't told another living soul. "My name, my reputation in that town," he started, his gaze fixed on the fire. "It's earned. I was a scout for the army for a time. After that, I hired out my gun. Did things I'm not proud of for men who paid well." He didn't look at her. He couldn't. "I saw a lot of killing. Did my share of it. One day I just couldn't do it anymore. The money felt like ash in my pocket. So I came here. Bought this piece of worthless land that nobody wanted. Figured if I could make something grow out of this rock, maybe I could wash some of the red off my own hands." He fell silent, the weight of his past filling the small room. He had expected her to recoil, to look at him with fear or judgment. Instead, when he finally chanced to glance at her, her expression was one of profound understanding. They were both running from a past that had tried to define them, seeking refuge in a place that promised nothing. The next few days passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. Leanne proved to be as resilient as she was quiet. She helped him with the chores, mending his worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, tending to the small vegetable patch with a gentle, knowing hand. She learned his routines without him ever having to explain them. The peace was broken a week later by the arrival of 2 riders. One was the town's deputy, a man named Riggs, whose loyalty was for sale to the highest bidder. The other was a stranger in a city suit. Riggs stayed on his horse while the other man dismounted, a sheaf of papers in his hand. "Jedediah Stone?" the man asked, not waiting for an answer. "I'm Mr. Davies, from the Territorial Land Office. I'm here to serve you this notice." He held out a paper. Jed took it. It was a legal document, full of dense, official language, but the meaning was clear. It was a notice of foreclosure on his water rights. According to a forgotten county ordinance from 1862, the rights to the creek that bordered his property belonged to the downstream landowner if the upstream user failed to maintain a proper levee. The downstream owner was Orville Abernathy. "The levee's fine," Jed said, his voice flat. "Not according to Mr. Abernathy," Davies said with a smug smile. "He filed a complaint. An official survey was done. It was found lacking. You have 30 days to vacate the claim." It was a lie, a fabrication built on bribery and paperwork, but it was legal. Without water, his homestead was just a patch of sun-baked dirt. Everything he had worked for, his entire hope for a quiet future, was about to be turned to dust. Deputy Riggs finally spoke, his voice lazy and confident. "There is another way, Stone. Mr. Abernathy is a reasonable man. He's willing to forget this whole water rights business. All you have to do is turn over the girl. He'll see she gets put on a wagon to the work camps. Out of his sight, out of his mind." The choice was laid bare. His land, his future, his peace, or her. Jed looked over at the dugout. Leanne was standing in the doorway, her face pale. She had heard everything. She stood there with that same impossible dignity she'd had in the desert, ready to accept her fate. She expected him to choose his life over hers. Any sane man would. He looked at his dry fields, the dream of redemption withering on the vine. Then he looked back at the deputy. He slowly tore the legal notice in half, then in quarters, and let the pieces fall into the dust. "Get off my land," he said. Riggs' smile vanished. "You're a fool, Stone." "Get off my land," Jed repeated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that promised consequences. The deputy and the lawyer shared a look, then turned their horses and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and the certainty of ruin behind them. Jed stood there for a long time, watching the dust settle. He had just thrown away everything. He felt a touch on his arm. It was Leanne. He turned to face her, expecting to see despair. Instead, her eyes were clear and focused. She looked at the parched earth, then at the low line of hills to the east. "My father taught me how to find water where others see only stone," she said quietly. 4 months later, the autumn air was crisp and cool. The brutal heat of summer was a distant memory. A man standing on the porch of the Abernathy General Store would have seen a landscape transformed. Where Jed's land had been brown and barren, there were now patches of determined green. A new, deep well lined with stone stood near the dugout, a testament to weeks of back-breaking labor with pick and shovel. Leanne, using knowledge of geology passed down through generations, had shown him where to dig, following subtle shifts in the rock and vegetation that he had never noticed. They had found a deep, reliable spring, one that owed nothing to Abernathy's Creek. The changes weren't just on the land. The new spur line for the railroad had been completed, but the depot wasn't built in Redemption Gulch. The surveyors, tired of Abernathy's price gouging and poor hospitality, had chosen a spot 2 miles out, not far from Jed's homestead. A new community was sprouting there, a collection of tents and rough cabins. Freighters and homesteaders, drawn by the new depot and the promise of fair dealing, bypassed Redemption Gulch entirely. They came to Jed and Leanne for fresh water from their well and vegetables from their garden. Orville Abernathy's power had been built on a foundation of isolation and control. The railroad and a reliable source of water he didn't own had shattered it. His business dwindled. The people he had bullied for years no longer feared him. One Tuesday morning, he packed 2 suitcases, sold his store and his worthless water rights for pennies on the dollar, and boarded the eastbound train without a word of goodbye. His reign was over, not with a bang, but with the quiet turning of wagon wheels down a different road. Jed stood by the new well, drawing a bucket of clear, cold water. He passed the dipper to Leanne first. She was no longer wearing the white prairie dress. That had been carefully washed and put away in her trunk. She now wore a simple, durable dress of blue calico, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. The sun had brought a healthy color to her cheeks, and her hands, though calloused from work, were never still. They had built a life here, word by word, stone by stone. She drank from the dipper, then handed it back to him. Their fingers brushed. It was a simple, accidental touch, but it sent a warmth through him that had nothing to do with the sun. He had ridden into the wasteland seeking to be alone, to bury the man he had been. He had found his solitude, but he had not expected to find a future there too. A life wasn't about the land you claimed, he realized, watching the way the light caught her dark hair. It was about the person you chose to stand on it with. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.